Good afternoon, everyone. You are the few brave souls that have stuck around for a Thursday afternoon presentation a few hours before our JLo concert. So either you are interested in this topic or you're just looking for a place to rest. But I'll do my best to make the topic relevant and interesting for you today. My name is Ben Redwine. I lead the value engineering function for Ariba. The topic that we're covering today is actually broader than Ariba. But before we get into how you manage all your categories of spend with business networks, what I wanted to speak to first was something to kind of level set in terms of a framework for how you should think about what managing spend means. So managing spend has different definitions to different people within an organization. So managing spend could mean negotiating savings. It could mean getting compliance to those savings that you've negotiated. It could mean just simply automating the process of managing those spend categories. And it often means, cycle time improvement and process efficiency and what you can do with that. So if you take into account those types of outcomes that come from managing spend categories, there are a couple things that I would say are required in order to put in place best-in-class capabilities to ultimately manage all of those categories of spend. One is your collaboration with suppliers. How you discover, connect, and collaborate with suppliers is ultimately important to driving things like process efficiency or discovering new sources of supply, or just how suppliers engage with you when it's time to actually request and buy something. The other thing that's important to think about when you're thinking about managing all categories of spend is that it's an end-to-end process. So managing all categories of spend means how you go and source and contract a category, but it also means how you request and buy that category, and ultimately how you invoice and pay for that category. So I'll talk about ultimately how you address those different categories across that business process. And then the last element of it, obviously, is when we say categories, what do we actually mean? Well, categories can be direct materials and supply chain related purchases. There can be indirect materials. You can have services and labor, and there's also travel. So what I would offer up as two challenges to think about that I'll try to address for you this afternoon is, how do you manage all categories of spend from a source to pay standpoint when really it's not a one-size-fits-all approach across these different category areas? The other thing that I'll talk about as well is how it's different industry by industry. If you're a bank, what you spend money on, what your spend profile is quite different than if you're an oil and gas company or if you're an auto manufacturer. So the approach for managing categories of spend, all categories of spend, is different based on what you actually buy, based on the good or service that you provide to your end customer. So let's talk about how to address those two challenges. So our goal will be to address what the best-in-class capabilities are to managing all of your spend and doing that by industry. But also, what I want to try to do is actually not make the discussion today specific to solutions. I want to talk about capabilities that you would need to manage these categories. And then you can ultimately map what are the correct solutions to those categories. But I think because we are at Sapphire, and because I think a lot of people have questions about Ariba versus Fieldglass versus Concur versus SAP, how do all of those things fit into a framework or an area to ultimately manage those categories? So with that kind of framework set, let's actually dive in. Let's start to talk about the different approaches that you would take to manage these categories. And we're going to start with source and contract. So I mentioned, let's take an industry-specific approach. So the industry I chose as an example today was consumer products. I'm happy to talk to any of you afterwards in our meeting session if you operate in a different industry and you want to talk about how this would apply to your particular industry. But for the sake of consumer products, if you look at the categories of spend that they have, you have things like raw materials and logistics and product design, which are all very strategic, complex categories for companies, like in the CPG industry. And then you have things like marketing and advertising and legal services, which are strategic, important categories, and they can be very big spend areas for companies, but they may not be as core to the business as the actual raw materials that go into the consumer product. And then you have things that are much more commoditized, like MRO or IT equipment and whatnot. So once again, taking this industry example, and if we talk about sourcing, what are the approaches that you can take ultimately to say, I'm managing 100% of my addressable spend? So the first strategy is what I would call a sole source strategy. So if you take raw materials as an example, I'll use Coke as an example. Coke, one of their raw materials is ingredients, the ingredients that they use to actually produce Coke. Well, Coke isn't going to go out and look at different suppliers and evaluate, on a year-over-year basis, the suppliers that they would want to go do business with to produce their ingredients. That's very proprietary to what they do. So the approach that you would take for very strategic categories within your company is what I would call a sole source strategy. And sole source means that you're really just managing a strategic relationship with a finite set of suppliers, and the capabilities that you actually need to do that are much more focused on managing the risk associated to doing business with that supplier, managing the performance of that supplier. Often you have very complex contractual arrangements, and managing those contract terms and the compliance to those terms. Now, if we take marketing's still a very important category for CPG as an example, but marketing is an evolving area. You've heard in some of the keynotes about the digitization of our economy and how businesses are rethinking what they're doing. Well, marketing is one of those areas that's evolved from radio to TV into now kind of, internet mediums as an example. So there is an evolving set of requirements. There's an evolving supply base that can ultimately meet your marketing needs. And for that, what I would suggest is a more competitive process to managing the category. And so if you think about those types of categories, what you need there are tools to analyze your spend data. You need to have tools to go out and discover new sources of supply. And then you need to have tools where you can actually collaborate with those suppliers to see if what they offer from a good or service perspective meets your needs. Now, those categories that you would strategically manage via sole source or competitive, that typically makes up for a consumer products company about 75% of your spend. But you still have 25% of your spend that I would argue is not going to ever be strategically managed. Will actually be managed on an ad hoc basis. And these are things that just come up where they're not on a contract, and often they're below a certain price threshold where procurement wouldn't even necessarily want to go invest in a strategic process to put a contract in place. So that ad hoc spending, you need to have capabilities to manage that as well. And so often what we see there are spot quoting or 3 bids and a buy, where you tactically go out and just quickly get 3 quotes so you can quickly turn around a qualified supplier to do business. And there's also this concept of a spot buy. And a spot buy is effectively procurement wants to have no involvement in sourcing that category. They don't even want to do 3 bids and a buy. They just want to give access to a marketplace that they've approved, and that whenever you go buy things on that marketplace, just like Amazon.com, that ultimately that marketplace will have the right workflow and the right approvals and visibility in place into what's being bought, even if you don't have it under your contract. So for sourcing, the way that you manage all categories to drive negotiated savings and to drive the relationships of your suppliers is sole source, competitive, and ad hoc. So let's talk about once the contract's in place. So you have a contract in place now. You've gone out and sourced your raw materials. You've sourced labor and services. You've sourced indirect materials and IT equipment as an example. When you're actually now buying off of those contracts, you're going from a few people who are sourcing categories to thousands of people in your company who are buying goods and services. And so what I would argue for when you look at your actual procurement process, that you think of things less as categories and more as buying processes. So if we look at indirect, direct, services, and travel, there are different buying processes that a consumer products company would ultimately leverage for managing all of their spend. And in this case, what they care about is spend compliance, and they care about process automation. They want to realize the savings that they've gone out and negotiated. So here, as you can see, is a spend profile that a typical CPG company would have across those buying processes. And there's two things that they care about. Buyer adoption, so your internal user, your requester, and the adoption of a seller. So if you look at each of these category areas, the buying processes have to tie into what those requesters are used to doing. And some of those are very casual requesters that are rarely ever going to go buy something. And then you got people who are in systems every day buying things. So for indirect materials, your corporate indirect materials, office supplies, business cards, IT equipment, you need a catalog buying experience, as simple as when you go out and you buy as a consumer today. You don't need training on that. You just need to be able to have something where you can go in and casually buy it quickly and get out. But if you get into temp labor as an example, the bottom services buying process. Well, temp labor, this is a completely different buyer within a company who's looking at database administrators, or they're looking at clerical staff. And for categories like that, they're often recruiting these contractors, this external workforce onto their company. And so that means onboarding, setting up access to networks, giving them security badges. And so there's a process that they do today to recruit that labor. Well, then how you buy contingent labor needs to fall into that same recruiting, staffing process for them to adopt it. Or then you take travel. Well, travel people are used to going out and seeing flights availability, hotel availability, car service availability. How they go do that is not off a catalog. They go out to Delta or Starwood, or maybe you have a travel booking provider, and there needs to be a mechanism in which to go out and quickly book your travel. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but those different buying processes are different capabilities for different users within an organization. Now, the seller piece is as important to think about as well. Because once again, if you want to drive adoption, if you want to drive compliance and automation across managing all of these categories of spend, your sellers need to be able to ultimately, in some instances, provide catalogs and content to you. Or if it's direct and inventory managed things, you might be sending them demand schedules and forecasts of things that you're going to ultimately need. Or they might need to send resumes and CVs to you of candidates. So there's different things that sellers need to collaborate on as well. And capabilities need to be in place to support both easy buying experiences for those different processes, these different engines, once again to handle 100% of the spend, but also to have an intelligent network, an intelligent portal where all of these different collaboration types for sellers are made possible for them as well, to plug into their e-commerce processes. And the one thing that often gets left out in this whole process when you think about managing categories of spend is accounts payable, the invoice and the payment process. But your suppliers often may not be compliant to your contracts. Your requesters may get tied up in approving invoices, and you may ultimately miss out on further cost reduction opportunities that you might get if you're willing to pay suppliers more quickly. So managing a category has to be end-to-end. It has to be all the way through the payment. So for a CPG company, the way I would think about it is average CPG company, it takes about 41 days for them to pay a supplier from when an invoice comes in to a payment. The challenge with an average CPG company is, one, they're probably paying that supplier sometimes too soon compared to their peer group. And two, it takes them a long time, often longer than what their agreed upon terms are, to actually pay those suppliers. So there's not a lot of window in which they have any wiggle room to figure out, when they actually want to pay the supplier. So best-in-class management across all categories of spend for a CPG company would be, on average, instead, paying in 55 days. but condensing the process of approving that invoice, capturing and approving that invoice from 25 days down to 5 days. What that actually does is create this 50-day payment window. Now you've got 50 days where you can monetize that speed. You can either pay them in 5 days or 55 days or sometime in between. And I'm going to talk about what that actually means in terms of value. But first, how you actually go from 25 days to 5 days. There's two things. One is actually capturing that invoice in an electronic, intelligent manner. The analogy I often use is when you go to a post office and or you're having mail sent to you at your home, wouldn't it be nice if the postman actually opened up your utility bill before you got it and looked to see if there were any errors in the invoice, and if they actually said, you know what, there's invoicing Ben the wrong amount, I'm going to go resolve that invoice before Ben even gets the bill and even has that 30-day due date. That's effectively what a business network does. It has intelligent error recognition that before an invoice can even be created and sent to accounts payable, it comes in smart, clean, and validated. The other thing is what I call buy right, pay right. If you're buying at a line level off of a purchase order or a contract up front, whether it's a catalog or temp labor or travel, if you're buying in a compliant manner up front and you get that approval up front, you don't need any approval in the back end. It's what's called touchless. So that's what condenses these windows from 25 days down to 5 days for consumer products. And that differs industry by industry based on the types of things you're purchasing. And often that means up to 40 to 60% operating cost reduction within a company to then manage those exceptions, manage the processing of those things. What's more interesting though is you turn AP into a profit center. Now accounts payable says to a supplier, I can either pay you in 55 days or I can pay you in 5 days. It's up to you. If you want to get paid in 5 days, I just ask for a 2% discount in return. So now you're saving money, and that typically adds up to about $1 to $2 million per $1 billion of spend for a company that they can save by monetizing that cycle. But it doesn't matter unless you also monetize the payment. If you send a supplier a check that then takes 3 to 7 days to get in the mail, they go to their lockbox and then they deposit that check, there's no early payment. It has to be electronic. And so when you think about this, let's sum all this up, right? And I know this is an eye chart, but I'll explain why I'm showing you this eye chart in a second. End-to-end category management to drive negotiated savings, to drive compliance and realize those savings, to drive process efficiency, to drive better working capital management. That end-to-end category management means you've sourced those categories through sole source, through strategic sourcing, or through ad hoc, and then you buy those categories in a very easy manner, and then you use an intelligent network to do your collaboration with sellers across all of these collaboration points, and then ultimately you reconcile and pay those invoices, whether it be against a purchase order, a contract, a service entry sheet, an expense report, or a time sheet. That is end-to-end category management across source to pay. I didn't want to bring solutions into this because these are just capabilities. And these are just what best-in-class companies look like and the capabilities that they put in place. And this is where you see companies talk about 90, 95, 100% automation of their spend categories and driving 4, 6, 8% costs out of their SG&A and out of their COGS. But once again, we're at Sapphire and people are interested in what's SAP's portfolio to do this. And there's a lot of solutions that I'm hearing about. So if you take the same graphical representation, a perspective around what those portfolio of products would be this. So Ariba has the capabilities to analyze your spend, discover new sources of supply, run sole source negotiations, run competitive events, run reverse auctions, manage contracts, manage risk, manage performance. All of those sourcing activities to manage all of those categories, including the ad hoc, can be done in Ariba. I'm going to jump to the bottom. All of your collaboration with suppliers can be done on intelligent business networks, as well as the payment and the invoicing of those suppliers. But then the hard part, the buyer adoption, the working with the masses, whether it's a casual admin or somebody working in a plant or HR who's buying contractors, that's where the buying processes really have different options for you that tie into the broader processes that they do. So for travel, it's Concur. For contingent labor and SOW spend, it's Fieldglass. For complex services, it's Ariba. For indirect materials, it can be Ariba or it can be SAP SRM. And if you get into things like managing assets or managing inventory, SAP has very strong plant maintenance and materials management projects to handle those core inventory management capabilities. So this is SAP's vision. Create a business network group that has all of these capabilities to manage all of your spend under management in an end-to-end manner, and to do it outside the four walls of your organization with suppliers. So I thank you for your time today, and as I said, anybody that has questions is welcome to talk to me afterwards. Thank you.